Hello and welcome to this, the ninth and penultimate of my series of videos showing you my sketches of properties on the London Monopoly Board and just giving you a little bit of hopefully interesting facts about them. So we finished the colour properties in our last video, and in this, our penultimate one, we're going to look at the stations. Now this is my drawing of King's Cross Station. As you can see, it is not actually in one of my sketchbooks. I used a very different pad of paper because this was the first one I made using my coloured fine liners, and I really wasn't sure how it was going to turn out. So King's Cross, it's not the oldest mainline railway terminus in London. Euston, just down the road, is several years older. It's not the most visually striking. The Grand Midland Hotel, part of the St Pancras complex right next door, steals the attention away from its neighbour. But I think King's Cross is a remarkable building. In some ways it's difficult to believe it dates all the way back to 1852. The relative simplicity of the facade, with its lack of ornamentation, seems to me to belong more to the 1920s or 30s. Mind you, having said that, the Italianate clock tower between the two huge arched windows does humanise the building a little bit, and it puts me in mind of a similar feature on Queen Victoria's Osborne House. Of course, King's Cross has got a permanent place in popular culture. It's the station from which the Hogwarts Express departs in the Harry Potter novels, platform 9 3/4, I think. It's not actually where it departs from in the films. It looks like King's Cross because you see the exterior, but I believe the platform shots were actually filmed on Marylebone because it's so much quieter. We'll come to that. Now, the horse-drawn tram on the far right gives you just a little bit of help of dating from when this image is from, although not necessarily as much as you might think, because the first horse-drawn tram in London was as early as 1861, while the last horse-drawn tram in London ceased in 1915. Like a lot of the reference photos I used to help me make these Monopoly drawings and other sketches of London, I would date this between the last decade of the 19th and the first decade of the 20th century. It's just a personal preference. One of the interesting idiosyncrasies of the London Monopoly Board is the choice of properties that were made. If you think about the stations, King's Cross makes perfect sense. You can certainly make out a case for Liverpool Street. But Marylebone and Fenchurch St, surely, to name but a few, Paddington, Euston, Victoria, Waterloo, all have a greater claim. Well, in my very first video, in the introduction, I explained how Victor Watson of Waddington's acquired the rights to Monopoly for the UK and volunteered to spend a weekend scouting out locations to use. Now, the thing is, our Vic wasn't very familiar with London, allegedly not a great lover of the city, though I don't know how true that is. So what he seems to have done is taken the train from Leeds, Waddington's were a Leeds company, which would have brought him to King's Cross on the LNER, and he just seems to have plumped for all LNER stations at that time. So let's move to Marylebone. Poor old Marylebone. Can't help feeling a little bit sorry for a station for which hardly anybody seems to have a good word. It was the last of the London Railway termini to be built, and it is very much the poor relation amongst them. It's got nothing like the grandeur of King's Cross, St Pancras, Paddington and the original New Euston, to name but a few, but I can't help having a soft spot for it. One reason is because it's the station the Beatles are chased through in their first and best film, A Hard Day's Night, where I think it's posing as Liverpool Lime Street. Another reason is that it was a project which was pushed through by one of my very favourite crusty old Victorian Edwardian curmudgeons, a man called Sir Edward Watkins. Now, Sir Edward was chairman of several railways, most notably the Metropolitan Railway, which was the world's first underground railway. Watkin did not like the fact that another of his railways, the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway, had no line into London, and so it lost valuable traffic to the Great Northern in King's Cross. Eventually he obtained parliamentary permission to extend the MSLR, which was now called the Great Central Railway, into London at Marylebone. The station opened to traffic in 1898. This Great Central Railway became part of the LNER in the 1923 rationalisation of most of the railways in Britain into the four main companies: the LMS, London Midland Scottish, the Great Western, GWR, the Southern Railway and the LNER, which, as we said, is probably why Vic chose it in the first place. By the 1980s, Marylebone was a serious candidate for closure. This was due to its quietness compared with other large London stations, which is what's made it so popular with filmmakers over the decades. But coming back to the great curmudgeon Edward Watkin, he did, to give you an example of what made him such a curmudgeon, he delayed the building of London's Circle Line connecting the Metropolitan Railway and the Metropolitan District Railway, which eventually became the District Line. And he delayed it for decades simply because he didn't like the chairman of the Metropolitan District Railway, a man called James Stats Forbes. And this was despite the fact it would have greatly increased the revenue for both railways. But my favourite thing about Sir Edward Watkin is he's best remembered probably for attempting to build London's answer to the Eiffel Tower on the site where the old and now the new Wembley Stadium stand. The tower only reached its first stage before it was found that changes to the original design meant that the legs were unstable. It was originally designed with 8, I think. That was cut to 4 and that didn't work. Work was stopped for good shortly before Watkin's death in 1901, and the whole thing was dynamited and demolished by 1907. But if you look at aerial photographs of the building of the original Wembley Stadium in the 1920s, you can clearly see where one of the footings had been on an area where the pitch would be laid out. Well, that's enough about Marylebone. Let's take a trip to Fenchurch Street station. So there aren't many London Monopoly Board properties, actual properties, that I've never visited in real life. In fact, I think Fenchurch Street Station is the only one. The world's first railway linking two cities, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, opened in 1830. The railways reached London in 1836 with the opening of London Bridge Station. By the middle of the 1830s, new railways were booming, and they'd go on booming for 10 years until the crash of 1845. And everybody wanted a piece of the pie. And although the majority of planned railways in this period were never even built, a huge number of railway companies had their eyes on London. So Fenchurch Street Station was built in 1841 for the London and Blackwall Railway. Through acquisitions and mergers, it served a number of different railway companies. When the vast majority of Britain's railways were rationalised into the 4 companies, which I mentioned earlier, Fenchurch Street actually served 2 of them, the LMS and the LNER. Fenchurch Street is the only London terminus on the board which is not also a London Underground station. In the 1990s, it was planned to connect Fenchurch Street with the Jubilee line or to extend the Docklands Light Railway a few hundred yards, which would put it onto the network. But neither of these plans came to fruition. Fenchurch Street largely connects the City of London with Essex. The current building dates back to 1854. And sorry guys, but that's basically all I can tell you about Fenchurch Street. So let's move to our last station, which is Liverpool Street. Right, here's a Monopoly trivia question for you to think about. In 1935, when our Victor and his secretary Marjorie made their scouting visit to London to work out which properties to use, which of the 4 stations they picked was the busiest? And the answer? Well, it's Liverpool Street. How come? Well, Liverpool Street, between the 2 world wars, wasn't just the busiest of those 4 stations. It wasn't just the busiest in London, it wasn't just the busiest in England, it was actually the busiest station in the whole world. Now, compared with King's Cross and Fenchurch Street, Liverpool Street was a relative newcomer, first opening in 1874. Now, if you're wondering how it could be that the London North Eastern Railway ended up with all of these termini in central London, well, none of them were actually built for the LNER. As I said, it was only 14 years old when Vic and Marge first alighted at King's Cross, which had previously been the terminus of the Great Northern Railway. Marylebone, terminus of the Great Central Railway. Fenchurch Street had been through many owners before the LNER, and Liverpool Street was built as the terminus of the Great Eastern Railway, particularly serving East Anglia and the east of England, which it continues to serve. Now, in his book, Britain's 100 Best Stations, which I can highly recommend, journalist Sir Simon Jenkins, who served on the board of British Rail throughout the 1980s, described how Liverpool Street came very close to being demolished in the 1970s. It survived, not least because of the energetic defence by the preservation movement, led by Sir John Betjeman, who was still smarting from the demolition of Euston Station. Now, the plan to demolish Liverpool Street did lead to a public inquiry at the end of 1976, going on into 1977. Now, since then, the station has been greatly redeveloped, but sympathetically so. Every effort's been made to keep up the character of the original station, and I think it's succeeded very well. Well, that's the stations, ladies and gents. In our next and last video, we'll be looking at everything else, encompassing the 2 utilities, electric company and waterworks, jail, go to jail, and free parking. Lots of interesting stuff there, so I hope you can join me. Bye.